This is Professor Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina for delivering a lecture for the class POLI 201, American National Government. And this is actually topic 4D, the second part of a lecture on political parties. And in this second lecture, on this part 2 of a 2-part lecture, I'm going to talk about the issue of party realignments. And keep in mind, class, that this is a part of a broader section, the broader section of section 4, where I'm talking about various mediating institutions, various institutions that link the people to the government. All right, I have my little donkey and my elephant representing the donkey representing the Democratic Party and the elephant representing the Republican Party. Those are images that came from the late 1800s into the 1900s with the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast, who began to trade, who as a cartoonist and political cartoonist began to portray the Democrats as the stubborn but persistent, hardworking donkey, and the elephant, the Republicans, as the slow-moving but mindful elephant. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about realignments, and we're going to talk about it in 2 ways. I want to talk about party errors, not errors in terms of mistakes, but eras in terms of periods. In what ways have the parties changed over time? And in this lecture, I'm going to emphasize the historical principle in terms of our principles of politics. Clearly, history matters in how parties have changed over time. And I'm going to do a realignment review. So I'm going to give you the history, and then I'm going to rearrange that history into the various realignments that have occurred. Now, what do I mean by realignment? I will talk more directly. I will define it more directly. But just as a first pass, realignment is when there's a sort of major shift of support from one party to the next to create a new dominant coalition. So there's a shift in the electorate, there's among voters, there's a shift in those who are elected to office to make one party the new dominant party over another party. All righty. Now, even though I'm going to give you a lecture, I thought I'd give you a little presentation, a mini documentary, or really tiny documentary, only a few minutes, that will give you sort of a nice overview of how parties have changed over time, and that our 2-party system has changed over time. All right. So we'll refer to the great YouTube. Sorry, it's cutting it off a little bit there.
Actually, when the American Constitution was drafted, there was a lot of concern about political parties. So famously, some of the founding fathers wrote about the dangers of faction. But pretty quickly, as almost always happens in political life, parties developed. And for almost the whole history of the United States, what you've had are 2 dominant parties competing against each other. But then if you look at the US, don't mistake the fact that there are still 2 dominant parties for a lack of change or for complete stability. Because parties are ultimately coalitions. They bring together different interests, different social groups, and those groups move around, they change their allegiances, they gain and they lose strength over time. What is it that actually holds these coalitions together? Well, one thing, of course, is the possibility of actually wielding power. Because one of the things that we see from studying the history of American political parties is that coalitions form that are capable of actually winning the presidency and winning office. So if you look, for example, at the Democratic Party at the moment, it is a combination of blue-collar workers, African Americans, and relatively wealthy liberal white voters. And this is a coalition that is capable of actually winning elections. Realignment theory argues that certain seminal elections reshape the form of American politics fundamentally. Famously, for example, the New Deal election in 1932 establishes a new coalition which keeps the Democrats in power for the best part of 30 years. And we can see those arguments taking place again today. So the big debate here is about the Hispanic community. Are they going to become solidly Democratic supporting and thus make it very, very hard for Republican presidential candidates to win office? So one of the really striking things about American party politics is not that third parties or independent candidates have been absent. Quite the opposite. There are various famous examples we can think of, going back to Theodore Roosevelt, George Wallace or Ross Perot. And they've made some dent in achieving popular support. But partially because of the American electoral system and partially because of the resilience of the two-party system, these have been relatively brief flurries in American electoral history. While it has made very resilient to third-party challenges, the parties themselves have proved to be relatively permeable to outsiders. So a really famous example of this is Jimmy Carter in 1976. He's a governor of Georgia, a relatively small state, and certainly not considered a front-runner for high office. And yet in the post-Watergate environment, Democratic Party supporters and then the American people were looking for an outsider. It's an element of the institutional setup that the American parties have that such circumstances are possible. So there's a real tension in American political parties that the primary system and the power that that gives to party supporters, who we know at certain times might be far more extreme than the average voter, could undermine political parties in a big way. It could make them unelectable, it could push them out to the fringes. But at the same time, it provides a massive tool for reinvention at moments of political crisis. It's noticeable that, for example, there is no equivalent to a far-right party in the United States that you find in many European countries. So maybe this is the system accommodating those political tensions. One thing we can say about the American two-party system is it's been through depression, it's been through civil wars, it's been through global conflicts, it's been through massive scandals, including the unseating of a president. And yet it has stayed in place, it has remained resilient. But an important caveat to that is, if we're trying to predict the future, we shouldn't expect those two parties, even if they have the same names, to look the same as they do now in the future.
All right. Okay, so sorry the YouTube video there was getting cut off by the dimensions of my screen. So if you want to go back and look at that YouTube video in its entirety and see the whole video, meaning the whole screen, you can click on the link. I'll include this link in the PDF that I'm going to provide the class for this lecture. All right. So let's talk about the main political parties. You heard from that video that for the most part, since roughly 1856, there have been two main political parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. And I'm going to go over this party history real quickly. And I'm doing a little reading because I want to get through it quickly. But I want to give you some flavor of just how vibrant the American political party system has been over the years. And up to the creation of what became the modern party system in the mid-1850s, by that I mean that the Democrats, although the Democrats are actually the oldest party, they're a little older, or by about 30 years or so, of the Republican Party, that not until the 1856 election did you have sort of these two parties be the dominant parties. There was back and forth fluctuation between what would become the dominant two-party system. And we start with the Federalist Party back in 1788. Then we have the Democratic Party, Democratic Republican Party in 1790. Later it would morph into what would be just simply the Democrats. The National Republican Party of 1824, the Whigs of 1836, and then the Republicans of 1856. And then 1856 forward, we have this stability, or relative stability. So a timeline labeled How the Party System Evolved shows the evolution of the modern day two parties as well as third parties and independents. In 1878, the Federalist Party was formed and was the only major party in existence until the formation of the Democratic Republicans in 1790. In 1876, you had the Federalist Party began to decline in power, leaving the Democratic Republicans as the only major party until 1828, when they rebranded themselves the Democrats. In 1824, the National Republicans party was formed, but only lasted for one election. The Democrats existed as the sole party until 1836, when the Whigs were formed. The Whigs inevitably disappeared around 1848, once again leaving the Democrats as the only major party until the formation of the Republicans, also known as the GOP, the Grand Old Party, were formed in 1856. Both of these parties have continued to modern day under the same names they had at the time of their founding. In 1869, you had the Prohibition Party was formed and lasted until around 1916. The Socialist Party was formed and lasted until 1932. The only two parties out of all of these still in existence are the Democrats and the Republicans, the GOP. There are also numerous third parties. So the third parties are represented on the right side here. There are numerous third parties and independent parties that have formed over the years as well, usually for only one election cycle. These include the Anti-Masonic Party in 1832, also known as the first third party in American politics, as well as the first third party to hold a national nominating convention, and the first to announce a party platform. The Liberty Party, yes, there was a party against Masons. The Liberty Party in 1840, the Free Soil Party in 1848, the American Party in 1856, the Constitutional Union Party in 1860, the Greenback Party in 1880, the Union Party in 1888, Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party, in 1912, the Progressive Party in 1924, the States' Rights Party, also known as the Dixiecrats, in 1848. A lot of reading here. Wallace's American Independent Party in 1968, Anderson's National Union Party in 1980, Ross Perot's United We Stand Party in 1992. He then renamed it as the Reform Party in 1996. The Greenback Party in 2000, Ralph Nader's Independence Party in 2004, and finally the Green Party, Libertarian Party, Constitutional Party in 2008. In some cases, there was even a fourth party, but most of the third parties and independent movements only lasted for one election cycle. And by this, we mean that these parties actually got their candidates' names on the national party ballot. Okay, so now I know I gave you just the bare bones, what was the name of the party and when was it formed and what did it succeed. Later on in this lecture, particularly among the dominant parties, I'm going to say, what did they stand for? What were the coalitions that were formed in order to create these parties? And what were the main platforms of these parties? Okay? All right. So let's get a sense even of what these political parties looked like in 2016. And so for those of you who were of voting age in 2016 and you cast your vote in November of 2016, you may have noticed, and I think it was true, for most of the ballot in South Carolina, but not true for all of the ballot in South Carolina, that because each candidate and each party must get its candidate's name on the ballot of all 50 states to be competitive, of course. Otherwise, those are votes left on the table. But this graphic of table 12.1 shows just how much of the total vote each of the major party candidates got. So in terms of the popular vote, Donald Trump as a Republican candidate got roughly 62 million or 62.6 million or 62.7 million to round up, or 46% of the vote, 46.1%. Hillary Clinton as the Democratic candidate got 65 million or 65.2 million and 48.03% of the vote. Now, I'm sure you looked at those you may have looked at those totals and say, hey, where's the other percentages? The other percentages, about 3% went to Gary Johnson, the Libertarian Party. Jill Stein got about 1% of it from the Green Party. Evan Mullen of the Independent Party, less than 1%. and all of these are less than the percent. Daryl Castle of the Constitution Party, Gloria La Riva of the Socialism and Libertarian Party, combining both the Socialist and Libertarian Party branches, or branches of the Libertarian Party, pardon me, Socialism and Liberation Party. That's quite different. Less than a percent, about a half a percent. Rocky De La Fuente with the American Delta Party, about 2%, and all others were less than 10%. So that gives you a sense that, yes, there are plenty of options, but there's really only two parties in town, only two options in terms of where most Americans will cast their vote, or where party rules and election rules will dominate to produce a outcome for the two major parties above all others. So let's talk about the party eras from 1796 to the present. This is a graphic from the campaign of William Jennings Bryan of 1896, when he gave his famous Cross of Gold speech, talking about arguing that the monetary system in the United States should not be backed by gold, because it makes the debts of farmers, of the working class, higher, or a gold-backed system advantages creditors more because of the value of gold. He argued for a silver system, and that would, particularly in those rough economic times of the 1870s and 1890s, eras of depression, would not hit as hard and as steeply against farmers and the working class. So he was making a case for a more populist economic or currency monetary system in the United States. So let's think about some particular terms and as an overview. What is a party era? A party era is a sustained period when one party is the dominant party and the majority of the voters identify with it. So we're going to walk through what was a major party at each time in each period of American history. And by that again, we'll walk through each party era. Not to be confused with error. Mistake. A political realignment. A political realignment is when different voters switch their party affiliations from one party to another, creating a new voter coalition. And this new voter coalition then also may benefit one, or it will benefit one major party in power in government. And so they become the new majorities in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, and possibly also with the presidency. Now, with political realignment, we have an antecedent term, a concept that comes before you have, or actually, I should say, they come in tandem with each other. They often accompany each other. You got to have one in order to produce the other. And so along with a political realignment, you also may have, or very likely have to have, a critical election. What is a critical election? It precedes a party era, becomes before it, and presents the political conditions for a realignment. Now, the reason why I said they might come in tandem, even though I say one comes before the other, is that it's likely that you have to first lay the groundwork prior to the election for a realignment to occur. That there's something, there are events, there are political leaders, there are new coalitions that emerge that create the groundwork for realignment that then shows up in a critical election. But how we actually know that a realignment has occurred, because we're social scientists, we have to have evidence. How we know an alignment has actually occurred is that there's a shift in an election that produces an outcome. We cannot say, we'll talk about that relative to the current period we're in, of have we had a realignment from the Democratic Party to some degree to the Republican Party more broadly. But we know realignments by virtue of critical elections. Okay. So let's think about these eras. And there have been 6 major party eras in the United States. I'm showing you here a picture of George Washington's first cabinet, and actually, I wonder if Thomas Jefferson is missing from this picture. I think Thomas Jefferson is standing, but I'm relying on an artist rep. I think that is in fact Jefferson, but I'm relying on the an artist's interpretation of what Jefferson looked like. But anyway, within within George Washington's cabinet, even though George Washington was against factionalism, he hated factions, he hated political parties, or he was very concerned about political parties. So much so that, as I said in the previous lecture, he asked in his farewell address that we be very mindful of not getting caught up in political parties. But given that, if the irony is that in his own cabinet were the seeds of the major party system, that in broad respect, that Alexander Hamilton would go on to be a founder of the of one of the major political parties, particularly those who were more Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson would become the one of the major authors of the Republicans or the Democratic Republicans, and both of these parties being very different in how they saw central government. Democratic Republicans being very concerned about centralized power, wanting power more vested in the states and at the grassroots level. Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists wanting power to be exerted by the central government. They wanted a strong central government versus a weaker central government that the Republicans or Democratic Republicans desired. Don't get confused by my use of the term Republicans or Democratic Republicans. In broad respect, just understand that these particular parties preceded what we know to be the Republican Party today. Okay. So 1896 to 1824, the first party system. The Federalists quickly took over power and here I am using a slightly different set of terms, but Jeffersonian Republicans or the Democratic Republicans. And in 1880, and certainly by 1816, they were no more. And remember, the Federalists were for strong central government. The Jeffersonian Republicans or the Democratic Republicans were for weaker central government, and they were also wanted more direct leadership from Congress versus the president as a quote unquote unitary executive. Then the election of 1824 created a split between the Democratic Republicans, later the Democrats, and the National Republicans, later the Whigs. And the Democratic Party and the Whig Party arose out of the Whigs snubbing Andrew Jackson in the election of 1824. Andrew Jackson, in fact, sort of led a revolt because of his being snubbed, him feeling that the Whigs were not giving due regard to his candidacy for president of the United States, and sort of led a resistance movement, a revolt against the Whigs in that regard. Then 1828 to 1854 was Jackson and the Democrats versus the Whigs. And this is a period we can call a period of sort of Jacksonian democracy, is when political parties became fully organized and mobilized huge voter turnout. If you go back and recall when I showed you the graphic of presidential voter turnout in the 19th century, you know it was quite high. It was quite high because, of course, the basis of eligibility were all white men. Eventually you had universal white male suffrage in this period. And so white males were highly mobilized, working class and on up the income scale. But women were not included, as you know. And African Americans were broadly excluded until we got into the 20th century. And not until the mid 20th century, in the 1950s, 1960s, did you have a broader expansion. But this period of Jacksonian democracy did create as a virtue the modern campaign. So where the candidate actually went out and spoke to folk. In fact, I know you might find it a little strange, but prior to sort of Jacksonian campaigning, to Andrew Jackson and the brand of politics that came along with Jackson, you didn't have presidential candidates actually go out, shake hands, and talk to people. They had surrogates go out and speak on their behalf. In fact, George Washington thought it a little bit sully to go out and shake hands and ask for votes beneath the office. And so it was in this period where the modern campaign, with modern slogans, with town halls and gatherings, with romp meetings, with sort of mass mobilization. It was all in this period where the modern sort of mobilization campaign occurred. Now, who were the Whigs? The Whigs were, whereas the Jacksonian Democrats were comprised were a populist party, but they were, just for a point of clarity, good folks, they were sort of a populist party, but they mixed their views with strong racial conservatism in their populism. And so, whereas the Jackson and then Martin Van Buren made the Democratic Party into a populist party, the Democrats were united on the issue of slavery. Jackson himself was a slaveholder, and the Jacksonian Democrats, although populist for white males, were strongly pro-slavery in their sentiments. They were strongly pro-slavery both in the North and in the South. And Jackson, in fact, himself asked for Congress to uphold slavery in 1835, and this tenuous back and forth of compromises around slavery would hold, of course, until the Civil War, although quite contentious and sometimes violent. The Whigs were comprised of Northern industrialists and Southern planters, but because they were included Southern planters who owned plantations, the Whigs were divided on the slavery issue and on abolitionists. And in the Whigs themselves were divided on the abolition question. All right? And it would emerge a little differently as we got, and these things would begin to contrast and sort themselves out around elections. Then the party era of 1858 to 1928. And you had sort of two Republican eras in this particular period. I'm showing you a picture of Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, with their famous 1856 Lincoln-Douglas debates. And this is when Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were having a series of debates around the state of Illinois to be elected to the office of senator for the state of Illinois. Now, these particular debates of 1856, well, first of all, Abraham Lincoln didn't win, Douglas won, but they were very eloquent but protracted debates, particularly on the issue of slavery. And Abraham Lincoln was anti-slavery, was for abolition, was for limited and incremental reform to bring about abolition. Stephen Douglas was avidly pro-slavery and maintaining a compromise between North and South, maintaining the status quo. And so they had these long debates and in this particular period of American history, you had debates that would range for 3 to 4 hours. And can you imagine listening to a speech for 3 to 4 hours? But they were a form of political entertainment in that day. And so people would come, pack a picnic lunch and sit there and listen to the candidates go on these stem winders for hours. But anyway, in this period, I got off on a little diversion, pardon me. But in this period, you had the Republican Party that we know today had its roots. It began in 1856 around abolition. And so they were creating this new coalition around abolition. And even though you had contrasting views, they all wanted to argue for free soil. And really, it wasn't necessarily that they were all sort of racial liberals per se, or liberals when it came to the rights of African Americans, but they were more concerned about the fact that slavery was becoming so dominant it was misplacing the working class, and particularly the white working class. That slave labor was misplaced, was undermining free labor. And so free soil became a mantra for all of them. And Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860. Of course, you know, we had the Civil War as a result, but Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in 1860, and the Republicans dominated the Congress and the national government until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. Then you had divided rule roughly between 1877 until 1896, when the Republicans became the dominant party everywhere except the solid Democratic South. The Democratic Party, the party of Andrew Jackson, became the party of the South for several generations, and really until 1960, for more than 100 years. And so to be elected in the South, you had to be a Democrat. But there was some degree of Republican dominance everywhere else in this period. Then you had the party era of 1962 to 1964, the New Deal coalition. And I'm showing you here a picture of part of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, the FDR coalition, the new coalition that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the former governor of the state of New York, created. And if I'm not mistaken, he was a cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, a former president. Or related to Teddy Roosevelt, I should say. So by the early 1920s, the Republican Party had become a party of big business, except out west. So the mantra, and it was an interesting coalition of folk who called themselves Republicans. You really had what we would consider modern day economic and social liberals and economic and social conservatives all in the Republican Party at this time, because you had individuals like Robert La Follette in Wisconsin, who argued for Social Security and minimum wage or reforms in Wisconsin to bring about an economic level of prosperity for the working class and the poor, particularly during periods of crisis. So you had that interest and that sort of reformism in the Republican Party, but you also had those who were for big business and were for big industry. That was true of the Republicans. The Democrats created a different coalition, and the coalition was sparked by the Great Depression of 1929, the record drop in the stock market, that caused President Herbert Hoover and the Republicans to lose favor. And it didn't happen all at once, but certainly that 1932 election prompted a realignment. And in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, and the Democrats became the major party, combining a coalition of the working class, of whites, working class, and some middle class in the South, along with minorities and older Americans in the North and other places. And FDR assembled this New Deal coalition. What's the New Deal coalition? It all centered around Roosevelt's very vigorous program of creating a number of new federal agencies and new federal projects that would stimulate the economy, from the Works Progress Administration. In fact, you can walk around the campus of the University of South Carolina today, and there are certain buildings that stem from the New Deal era, the New Deal coalition of federal monies and grants that were given to states and locales to directly get people back to work after the Great Depression had these record rates of a third to as high as half of the people unemployed given this economic crisis. And so the McKissick building on campus is a result of the, if I'm not mistaken, of the WPA, the Works Project Administration. But there are a number of other programs that emerged: agricultural adjustment, the National Labor Relations Act. All of these programs used to stimulate the economy, to bring about worker relief, etc. Then the next party era is the one we're in now. But the question, historians will have to tell us what period we're in now 20 years from now. And we might be in more than one party era, and your authors of your textbook may suggest we're in more than one party era. And so I want you to kind of keep that as a sort of bit of a question mark. If the present party era we're in is from 1968 to now 2016 or 2017. So the era of divided government. And in the era of divided government, we had sort of the landslide election of Lyndon Johnson, the Democrats, in 1964. Lyndon Johnson won over Barry Goldwater in the presidential election of 1964 by a landslide. But in some ways, Johnson looks back on the election and say, we won that battle, but we might have lost the war because you had defections from the South, from the Democratic South to the Republican Party as a result of some of the civil rights legislation and reform that Johnson pushed. And there had been this struggle around Southern candidates like George Wallace and the Dixiecrat and American Independence parties that were from 1948 to 1968 were pushing against the Democratic Party, arguing that, no, we want to be a party of states' rights and do not want the federal government to tell us what to do on the issue of civil rights. So it sharpened the differences between the parties, and eventually these coalitions became the coalitions we understand today. And from 1968 to 2004, the Republicans won the White House 8 out of 11 times. But we're going to move this forward a little bit. In 1994 and 1996, the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, first time in 60 years, and regained the House again in 2010. So sorting out where we stand now is really important because we do have this back and forth, so it appears, pattern occurring. We'll see what happens in 2018. We'll see what happens in 2020, right? And in 2010 and 2016, the GOP is the dominant party, but what will happen as we move forward in 2018 and 2020, okay? And under President Trump's leadership of the Republican Party, the ways in which the coalitions and the tensions in the party are emerging that may or may not lead to some losses or gains in seats. So we might be in an era of de-alignment. Again, I say might be because your authors are suggesting that it's in some ways it's a period, it's a relative period of instability, but it's a relative period of instability. There are ways in which clearly these party lines are starkly drawn now, but who actually is the party in power, the party that is the party in government, it might be the broader question. And this de-alignment is where voters identify more as independents than with one of the major parties. Now that is true. So the independents, the nones, those of mixed view, are the dominant quote-unquote party currently. And so what does that mean, particularly since right now the GOP, the Republican Party, has a majority of the gubernatorial seats. It has a majority of the governorships throughout the United States, a majority of the legislative seats in the United States, and controls both the Senate and the House in terms of majority, as well as, of course, the presidency by virtue of President Trump. And keep in mind, there's a difference between party in government versus party in the electorate, right? So the party in government right now is the GOP, is the Republican Party. The party in the electorate are independents. And some might argue, based on the graphic I showed you previously, that at least the second party after the independents are the Democrats, and then somewhat closely behind them are the Republicans in terms of party identification. But we'll see if this rumbling means that more independent candidates will emerge or more Democratic candidates will emerge. Let's see. So let's review sort of the history I gave you by virtue of a re-election history, the history of realignments. And I'm going to give you some tables that showed you the critical election, the parties that were in power, the issues, and the party realignment. So if you go back to 1828, you had the Democrats and the Whigs. The issue was Jacksonian democracy, the way in which Andrew Jackson was arguing for a vigorous executive, was arguing for some stronger powers within government, but he was also arguing this from the standpoint of creating a strong populist and grassroots appeal to his party. And clearly the Democrats dominated in this era. In 1860, you had the Democrats and the Republicans as the major parties. Slavery, and then later on, commerce became an issue. And commerce, particularly when we're talking about interstate commerce, when we're talking about the creation of, later on, we became the question of the creation of railroads, of the use of public dollars to invest in public projects. So the Republicans controlled until 1877, and certainly slavery and Reconstruction were an issue. But then 1896, the Republicans and Democrats were the major parties again. Commerce and money became the issue. This was a period of industrialization for the United States, a broad period of industrialization for the United States. And you had the ways in which you saw the question of exactly how do we deal with the economic instability that occurred in the United States, the 1873 Great Depression, the depressions of the 1890s, which affected the working class of farmers, of ordinary craftspersons, how those had a direct impact upon their economic fortunes, and was it due in part to the monetary system, the instability of the monetary system? In that sense, Republicans were dominated, but they had the solid South from Democrats. By the way, let me just make a note, because this is important in American history. Between 1828 and 1860, you had the Republicans emerge as the dominant party. And again, this was partly because the Whigs were comprised of Northern industrialists and Southern planters, but they were divided on the slavery issue, and the abolitionist Whigs divided their state parties. You had the Liberty Party and the Free Soil parties arose to create the challenge, and it was these parties that would coalesce into the Republican Party. But issues of commerce also were key. The Compromise of 1850 by Democratic Henry Clay of Kentucky caused real stir. And so that compromise created a instability, and when I say instability, it created a real fundamental dividing line in American politics, particularly around the issue of slavery, which of course would become a central issue, if not the central issue, along with uniting the Union, of the Civil War. Then you had sort of the New Deal realignment lasting until the 1860s, but political scientists have debated whether there has been a realignment in the last 50 years. So you had the Great Depression as the issue that prompted the critical election of 1932. Democrats dominated, especially in the U.S. House. And you and I have talked about why, in part, the way we structure House elections, why there is such an incumbency advantage in the U.S. House. In 1968, some might argue that was a critical re-election that proceeded after 1964 of law and order. There was a new Republican coalition emerged. It emerged around issues, particularly around civil rights reform, but you had the South, blue collar, or what would become known as Reagan Democrats, emerge, and suburbanites emerge as part of the Republican coalition. And so the Republicans were becoming a more dominant coalition. And then you have 1980, 1994, 1996, and in part, I'm putting question marks next to them because we're sorting out the degrees to which they were realignments. So you had social issues, government issues, welfare reform, the size of government all become contested issues. You had the Reagan Revolution in 1980, and the Republicans controlled Congress in 1994 and 1996. And then as we go on, this is just an extension of the previous discussion. In the critical election of 2006, the Iraq War and trust occur. The Democrats regained the House and later the Senate in 2008. Then a party realignment from the critical election of 2010 and 2014 when Barack Obama was president. Though he won by record numbers in 2008, he also lost by record numbers in the House and in the Senate, and across really sort of various state legislatures in 2010 and 2014. Some would argue that it was the economy, but principally also healthcare reform, which became a very contested issue, as you know, and was used in part to create new parties, really interest groups in some respects, but parties such as the Tea Party. And so Republicans regained the House and the Senate, and by 2016, as you know, Republicans also regained the presidency in Donald Trump becoming the 45th president. So the New Deal realignment, again, this is a repeat of the last bullet point, lasted to the 1960s, but political scientists have debated whether there has been a realignment in the last 50 years. All right, so for this section, I want you to know the terms of Federalist Party, the Democratic Republican Party, the Republican Party, and so, you know, by extension, the Democratic Party, party bosses and party patronage in critical election, realignment and de-alignment. For party bosses and patronage, look to the previous lecture because in that lecture I talk about, and I've talked about in other places, this idea that parties were created, were parts of political machines, and how these political machines, what do I mean by political machine? It was a well-structured, hierarchical, top-down organization that was ruled by those at the top to mobilize those at the bottom. And political machines were often corrupt. They often included graft and corruption, where the bosses would use their advantage of controlling or influencing those they got elected to office to then return things to the party. And personally, in the case of a boss tweed of Tammany Hall in New York, would directly line his pockets with government funds as coming from government contracts and government largesse. But these party bosses were challenged, as you know, from electoral reforms of the progressive era. And so the patronage, the rewards or benefits they handed out in order to get supporters to support the party, the patronage became less and less possible given these electoral reforms. But you know the terms of critical alignment, realignment, and de-alignment. So what have been the major party errors in American history and what critical elections spurred each? What do we mean when we say that we currently may be in a period of party de-alignment? Explain. Does partisanship have to lead to divisiveness? This is an argumentative question. If you ask me, Professor Shaw, what's the answer to that question? The answer to that question is, what do you think based on the evidence I've given you? Is partisanship or party polarization a bad thing or a good thing? Go back to my discussions of Abramowitz and of Fiorino. And then look back at the previous political party lectures. How do Americans identify with the main political parties? And what does that say about whether there's a dominant political party right now? What's the difference between the party and government versus party identification? And will we see a realignment because of the instability that independents are the main sort of identifiers of the main party identification now? Either, in other words, the main political identifier of political party now is neither. And so will independents swing to one party versus the other to create a new coalition? Okay. This has been a lecture by Professor Todd Shaw at the University of South Carolina for the class POLI 201, American National Governments. All rights reserved as part of this being Professor Shaw's intellectual property. Take care.